In 1513, Richard de la Pole, the seventh and youngest son of John de la Pole and Elizabeth of Suffolk, received an honor no one expected he would ever get. The French king, Louis XII, formally recognized him as the rightful king of England, building upon his earlier approval of Richard's claim to the throne the previous year. Louis XII's support went beyond mere words. Richard was entrusted with command of 12,000 men assembled in Normandy, ready to invade England on his behalf. The reigning English monarch, Henry VIII, never overlooked this looming threat. From that point forward, he regarded Richard not just as an overly ambitious exile, but as a dangerous adversary whose death became a priority. Though Richard's influence waned after 1514, Henry's determination to eliminate him did not waver. Before delving deeper into this turning point, however, we must first explore the question: who exactly was Richard de la Pole? Surprisingly, little is known about the early years of Richard de la Pole, the nephew of Edward IV and Richard III. Even his date of birth remains uncertain. While the commonly accepted estimate is around 1480, some sources suggest a broader range from 1480 to 1485. This means it is even possible that Richard was born during the very early Tudor era. In either case, his parents were relatively advanced in age at the time of his birth, possibly well over 30 and perhaps even over 40. John de la Pole was born in 1442 and Elizabeth of Suffolk in 1444. John lived until 1492 and Elizabeth until 1503. The couple's first child, also named John, was born in 1462, followed by 10 more children. If Richard was born in 1480, all 11 children would have been born within 18 years. However, if he was born in 1485, this span would extend to 23 years. If we assume Richard was born in 1485, his arrival may not have been planned, as the couple's second youngest child, William de la Pole, was born in 1478. The first 10 children were born approximately 2 years apart, making the 1480 estimate seem more likely. Still, this does not have to be conclusive. Biological factors, especially after so many years of childbearing, could explain a longer interval. Richard's eldest brother, John de la Pole, officially submitted to the Tudors in 1485, but turned against Henry VII just 2 years later by supporting Lambert's Simnel. He died at the Battle of Stoke in 1487. At the time, Richard was at most 7 years old, and possibly as young as 2. This likely explains why so little is known about his childhood. His parents likely sought to raise him quietly and away from the political turmoil surrounding their family. For the early years of Tudor rule, we know almost nothing about Richard de la Pole. Surprisingly, his name appears in a French source from 1492, identifying him as a soldier fighting the English. Given that he would have been only 7 to 12 years old at the time, this is likely a mistaken entry. Not everyone agrees with this interpretation, but I will address this point in more detail in my next video. I decided to create 2 episodes about Richard's story because there is considerable speculation about his character. Both videos can be easily understood independently of each other. After the death of Richard's father in 1492, the political leadership of the family passed to the eldest surviving son, Edmund. Officially, Edmund sought a lasting reconciliation with the Tudors and remained loyal during the Warbeck Rebellion. Considering that Richard would later demonstrate unwavering loyalty to Edmund, it is reasonable to assume that his older brother had a significant influence on his life during the 1490s. Edmund, however, had notable character flaws, to put it mildly. When he faced trial for a murder he had committed, he felt his honor was insulted for having to stand trial and fled England for the first time. Richard, however, stayed behind. In hindsight, this can be interpreted as a calculated move by Edmund, hoping that his absence would convince Henry Tudor to pardon him as a symbolic gesture. This strategy proved successful. Edmund was allowed to return, and from that point forward, Richard and Edmund became inseparable. I have already made a separate video about Edmund's actions and character, so I won't delve into those details here. Instead, I will keep the focus on Richard. In my opinion, there must have been a strong personal bond between the brothers, Richard and Edmund de la Pole. This is evident from their flight at the end of 1501. Notably, their brother William de la Pole, though still alive and free at the time, either could not or chose not to accompany them to the continent. As a result, he was found guilty of treason in 1502 and vanished into the Tower of London, where he would remain for an astonishing 37 years, the longest imprisonment of any individual there. Richard and Edmund accepted their brother's dramatic fate. They themselves were declared traitors in absentia. Despite this, James Tyrrell, who aided them in Calais, defied their precarious status. His support would cost him his life just weeks later. The brothers sought refuge with their aunt Margaret of York in Burgundy. Margaret had a history of opposing the Tudors, but by this time her circumstances had changed. She was elderly, had endured personal losses, and her financial resources were far diminished compared to the days when she supported rebellions like those of Lambert Simnel and Perkin Warbeck. The brothers hoped Emperor Maximilian could help. In 1502, while in Tyrol, Maximilian learned of their flight and their plans to overthrow Henry VII. Though he was not entirely opposed to assisting the York brothers, his support was ultimately superficial. He promised substantial aid, but confined it to granting them safe refuge within the Holy Roman Empire. The brothers settled in Aachen, as Maximilian allowed Henry VII to secure his neutrality through the Treaty of Augsburg, in which £10,000 changed hands. During this time, the brothers relied on a loan from the Count of Hardegg, who provided 20,000 guilders. This sum could have sustained them for many years, but they lived well beyond their means. By 1504, while still in Aachen, they found themselves cut off from financial support and unable to repay the loan. Facing this predicament, Edmund decided that Richard would remain in Aachen as collateral for the debt while he sought help elsewhere. Richard was deeply unhappy with this arrangement, but ultimately complied. His concerns proved justified. Edmund was captured in Namur in 1506 and handed over to the English. Henry VII, having promised not to execute Edmund, imprisoned him in the Tower of London, a decision he reportedly regretted for the rest of his life. His son, Henry VIII, however, was not one to repeat his father's reluctance. In 1513, Edmund met his end by the executioner's axe. By this point, Richard de la Pole had already achieved far more than his brother Edmund likely expected. Following Edmund's extradition, Erard de la Marche, Bishop of Liège, advocated for Richard's release from Aachen. The ambitious cleric, eager to secure a cardinalship, believed Richard might prove useful in the future. The last free York heir outside England was wise enough not to contradict this belief. Once freed, Richard made a decision that surprised Europe. He sought refuge in Hungary and pledged loyalty to King Ladislaus. The Hungarian king took a liking to his English follower and resisted all extradition requests from Henry VII. This marked the first time we can clearly observe Richard as an independent figure, revealing much about his character. And what a character this was! He gained a reputation as a skilled condottiere. Though he never married, he valued female companionship, as evidenced in the fact that he fathered an illegitimate daughter, Marguerite de la Pole, with an unknown mistress. Some speculate her mother was Marie of Sicily, though this remains unconfirmed. Marguerite had 9 children, and Richard's descendants, through her, are alive today. Richard stayed in Hungary and Bohemia, both under Ladislaus's rule, until 1509. After Henry VII's death, Richard and Edmund presumably hoped for a pardon from the new king, Henry VIII, and a chance to return to England. However, Henry VIII explicitly excluded the de la Pole from his general pardon, crushing their hopes. Events began to escalate rapidly. From his imprisonment, Edmund urged Richard to lead an invasion of England. The letter was intercepted by Henry's spies, giving the Tudor king the justification he needed to execute Edmund. Officially, Henry claimed he could not risk leaving Edmund alive while preparing for war with France. Unofficially, Henry's concerns were practical. With no direct heir at the time, and Catherine of Aragon's latest pregnancy unresolved, a defeat in France could make Richard a viable candidate for the English throne. Edmund's intercepted letter also provided a convenient pretext for Henry to rally support for his French campaign. Meanwhile, Richard turned to the French king, Louis XII, pledging loyalty in return for protection. Louis welcomed the Yorkist heir, defying Henry and granting Richard a pension of 6,000 crowns. This alliance proved mutually beneficial. Louis gained a weapon against England, while Richard secured a powerful ally. The exact timing of Richard's submission to Louis remains unclear, but records place him in Freiburg, modern-day Germany, in 1510. By 1512, Louis formally recognized the de la Pole family's claim to the English throne and backed Richard's efforts to reclaim it. That year, Richard joined a French campaign to invade Navarre. Although the invasion failed and the army suffered heavy losses, Richard distinguished himself as a brave leader, enduring the same hardships as his men, German mercenaries known as Landsknechts. His courage earned him the friendship of the celebrated French general Chevalier Bayard. His reputation was so formidable that despite his known ties to Richard, both Emperor Maximilian and Henry VIII released him without ransom after capturing him in 1513. In the same year, Richard commanded 6,000 men at the siege of Therouanne, proving himself an exceptional general and soldier. His growing prominence encouraged Louis XII to fulfill Richard's greatest wish, an invasion of England. Around this time, news of Edmund's execution reached Richard. In response, Louis declared him the rightful king of England, despite the existence of older siblings. Richard's status as the last truly free York heir solidified his claim. Henry VIII, however, saw this as an enduring threat. For as long as Richard lived, Henry sought to have him assassinated. By 1514, Richard commanded a force of 12,000 men in Normandy. Officially, the army had gathered to secure the region, but the fleet assembling on the coast left little doubt about the true intention: an invasion of England. The campaign was on the brink of launch when Henry VIII and his chief advisor Wolsey outmaneuvered the plan through a diplomatic coup. Henry married his sister Mary to Louis XII, effectively neutralizing the invasion threat. Although Henry had initially demanded Richard's extradition, Louis refused outright. The marriage nonetheless proceeded, underscoring how seriously the English government viewed the danger posed by Richard. This critical context is often overlooked in popular accounts of Mary's marriage to Louis, which is unfortunate. The situation was dire. Catherine of Aragon had recently lost her pregnancy, leaving Henry VIII without an heir. The de la Pole, with their royal bloodline and recognition by the French king, were a credible alternative to the Tudors. Henry desperately needed unequivocal recognition of his dynasty's legitimacy, but even his sister's politically calculated marriage achieved this only partially. Richard was ultimately not surrendered. Instead, he received letters of recommendation from Louis XII addressed to the civic authorities of Metz. Though Metz was officially part of the Holy Roman Empire, it operated as a free city and maintained close ties to France. The king requested that Richard be given a warm and friendly reception, and the city obliged. On September 2nd, 1514, Richard entered Metz in grand style, accompanied by 60 cavalry and escorted by a guard of honor provided by the Duke of Lorraine. The city extended its hospitality, offering wine, oats for his horses, and assurances of a safe haven whenever needed. One of Richard's allies, Chevalier Baudoir, even offered his own residence in Metz for Richard's use. However, 2 years later, Baudoir required the house again for himself. For Richard, this posed no difficulty. Thanks to his pensions from Hungary and France, his earlier financial struggles were a thing of the past. He rented a property known as La Haute Pierre, an estate that was demolished in the 18th century. In Metz, glimpses of Richard's personality emerge once more. He introduced horse racing to the city, but eventually stopped participating as he frequently lost money gambling on the outcomes. He also stirred controversy by seducing the wife of a prominent goldsmith, Nicolas Sebille. The resulting scandal became so significant that by 1519, Richard chose to relocate to Toul, where he resided on a church estate. Politically, Richard assumed all the titles associated with his family following Edmund's execution. He even styled himself as the Duke of Suffolk, a title formerly in possession of his family, but now officially held by Henry VIII's close friend, Charles Brandon. However, Richard remained unable to take meaningful action against the Tudors during Louis XII's reign. When Francis I ascended to the French throne in 1516, the political landscape shifted. Reports suggest Richard planned a second invasion of England on multiple occasions, with one such plan allegedly involving an attack from Denmark. By 1520, Richard had established a close friendship with John Stuart, Duke of Albany, in France. Albany became regent of Scotland for the young King James V in 1521, sidelining James's mother, Margaret Tudor, Henry VIII's younger sister. Albany's actions made him a frequent target of English hostility. This shared enmity deepened the bond between Richard and Albany. Scotland's renewed alliance with France led to a brief military conflict with England, during which Francis I appeared willing to support another invasion attempt. In 1523, Richard and Albany gathered forces in Brittany, preparing to cross the Channel. Some accounts falsely claim that the two men reached Dunbar and disembarked there. The reasons the invasion ultimately failed remain unclear to this day. After the failed effort, Richard and Albany parted ways. They never left Brittany. Speculation surrounds their separation, with some suggesting a personal rift, though no evidence supports this theory. Another possibility is that Francis I withdrew his support after suffering significant defeats at the hands of imperial troops in Italy, which likely redirected his focus and resources. Richard subsequently recruited Swiss mercenaries to support Francis I in his fight against the English. The French king and his English general crossed paths again during the siege of Marseille, where France emerged victorious. Once more, Richard distinguished himself on the battlefield. Following this triumph, Francis and Richard turned their attention to countering the emperor's army. However, this endeavor ended in catastrophe. Chevalier Bayard, Richard's longtime ally and friend, had already fallen in 1524. Tragically, Richard met a similar fate in 1525 during the Battle of Pavia, where the French army was almost entirely annihilated. Richard was among those killed, and Francis I was captured by Emperor Charles V. the last free member of the de la Pole family, was buried in Pavia. Despite Richard's lack of a pious reputation, the cathedral chapter of Metz resolved to honor him, decreeing that he be commemorated annually. News of Richard's death reached Henry VIII swiftly. The messenger, eager to emphasize the finality of the event, assured the king that he had personally seen Richard's body. Henry's immediate reaction was reportedly an exclamation, "All the enemies of England are gone." This response is striking, especially considering that William de la Pole still languished in the Tower of London, a confinement that would continue for nearly 15 more years. Evidently, the king didn't regard William as an enemy, but still as a potential threat. By this time, Henry's personal circumstances had evolved. With the birth of his daughter Mary and his acknowledged illegitimate son, Henry Fitzroy, the Tudor king now had heirs. Although Fitzroy could not inherit the throne, Henry saw his existence as evidence that he was capable of fathering sons, alleviating some of his legendary dynastic anxieties. Richard de la Pole, often referred to in historical sources simply as the White Rose, in reference to his origins in the House of York, is regarded as the last legitimate heir of Edward IV from this lineage. After his death, no York would ever again contend for the English crown, unless one considers the Tudors themselves, who were connected to the Yorkist line through Elizabeth of York. While other Yorkist heirs remained alive, their claims became increasingly tenuous. Margaret Pole, Richard's cousin, had children, and Anne St. Leger, another cousin, bore 10 children. However, their branches of the family tree drifted ever further from Edward IV. Furthermore, the Tudors had demonstrated their willingness to deal decisively with any potential rivals, often with the aid of the executioner's axe. The prospect of a restoration of the old ruling family was effectively extinguished. Why then would I choose to write a second part to this story? At first glance, it seems complete. The somewhat ironic answer is this: Ricardians suspect that Richard de la Pole may not have been who history claims he was. They are wrong, but I want to talk about it anyway. Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe to help this channel.